What is productivity? So productivity, the concept is how much you produce per hour. So the productivity gap is really a gap between typically Britain and another country. And in the case of Britain and the US, which is the one most people think about, that gap is around 20% right now. That gap's actually been around for a long time. So Britain used to be the most productive country in the world after the Industrial Revolution. So you're thinking kind of 1800. They maintained that lead until about 1900, then the Americans caught up. And the Americans have really been ahead of us ever since. So the last 20 years, there's been quite a big productivity gap with the Americans. And of course, it vexes policymakers because why are they doing the same stuff that we're doing but seem to be producing so much more? So why does the productivity gap exist? There's a lot of research in it. The types of stories people tell are around investment. So the old story that the British just don't invest enough, in part because maybe they're too short terms, they're looking for a very short payoff. Another story people often talk about is training. So they point to, the British are very good at training people at the top of the education distribution. So Oxford, Cambridge, these amazing elite world-class universities, but in the middle, British education is seen as kind of pretty mixed. Another argument is research and development. So British companies have been blamed for not doing enough R&D. Certainly if you look at German, Japanese firms, they spend much more on R&D. And then the final angle, which I've been working on a lot, is around management practices. It could be the case that British are, unfortunately, just bad managers. And given all their inputs, they just don't run their firms as well, and therefore they're not as productive.
Value chains are effectively the way that companies connect across a network to bring value to a final customer. Different types of firms and different types of divisions within firms add value. What's happened with the value chain in most industries is that it's globalized. The UK, as we all know, used to have a superb car manufacturing industry. It still has. Most of it is not owned by British companies. There are a very large number of foreign companies that have invested in the UK because it's actually very good at making cars. But what we've been forced to do as a country is move up the value chain to focus on research and development activities, design, coming out with new technologies to make cars more efficient. We've also been forced to focus on branding and consumer needs, as opposed to the cheap manufacturing end of automotive manufacturing.
One of the interesting things that has happened is the migration of value from one part of the sector to the next. So they don't innovate only in terms of the product, they innovate in terms of the business model, in terms of the way that they are able to connect to other players around the globe.
We're incredibly reliant on third parties, either because we've outsourced work or we've sent work offshore. Global value chains are all about saying, actually, there may well be collaborators that we could work with around the world that have particular skills that are useful for the product or service that we're trying to deliver.
Companies in Southeast Asia were able to move increasingly, upskilling themselves, changing their position, moving into service-intensive parts of the value chain.
One of the areas that AIM's done quite a lot of work is looking at the impact of offshoring work to India, for example. While we may outsource some work like call centres, which tend to be low value, they're relatively low paid jobs, we actually import some of the professional services. They can do it much more efficiently, we can get some economies of scale, and the entire process will become more efficient.
From the experience I've had with BAE Systems in a business-to-business environment, it's about what is the value of that partnership between BAE Systems as an organization and its customer. In partnered environments, it's joint productivity that matters. So it's about who does what best to achieve the benefits for both. And when you think about it together rather than being isolated in your own world, you actually get not just productivity, but a much higher level of effectiveness.
Financial services is an interesting example of what we quite mean by British, because all of the big banks and successful banks, certainly in investment banking, are foreign owned, but of course they're based on British soil. So when you think of British productivity, you think of the people that work down in the City of London in financial services, and they're extremely productive. They're not necessarily owned by British banks, but ultimately for us, we're not that bothered about it. As long as they're productive, paying taxes, making money in the UK, that's good.
In manufacturing, the productivity gap is largely closed. In retail, actually, we still have quite a big gap between the US and the UK. AIM's been looking at management practices and the extent to which management practices explain part of the productivity gap. There's quite a long tail of UK firms that have decided not to adopt those particular management practices, And if they did adopt them, they'd improve their performance. AIM's been able to look at the productivity gap inside firms, exploring the variation in performance, in productivity, across different branches in different locations in the UK. There is about a 50% variation in productivity between the highest performing branch and the lowest performing branch, even in the same organisation. So there are big variations even at a very local level.
There's an important link between management practices and improved productivity. In general, there's a rather simple relationship. Not too surprisingly, better practices result in better performance, which then results in better productivity. It's a little more complicated than that, because what is better performance depends on the nature of the individual organisation, the sector it operates in, how it competes, and various things like that. So it's not a simple matter of saying everybody has to do the same thing, but in general, focusing on improving management practices will have a significant effect, not only on performance, but also productivity.
To evaluate the impact of management practices on productivity, you can imagine working under David Brent from The Office. I mean, chaos reigns. It's very hard to work effectively. So we've been collecting data on management practices across a lot of firms across countries. And you see at the one end there are firms like Walmart that would be extremely productive, or General Electric. They measure everything, they monitor everything. People that do well rapidly get promoted. People that underperform kind of get retrained or moved to a less important area. And then there are other firms that I guess I shouldn't mention who they are, but are not very well managed. They're very unproductive in the sense that you'll find that repeated problems keep coming up. There's no incentive systems.